We are concerned not merely with the technical problem of securing and maintaining peace, but also with the important task of education and enlightenment.
What is consciousness? A quantum field? A structure in the brain? A multi-dimensional projection? The very essence of awareness that gives rise to life.
It's a mystery because we don't know what we're trying to explain.
There's people that fall into consciousness and material.
Consciousness has so many different meanings.
Consciousness is a hybrid, it's technology.
How does it connect us with our world, our universe, and life beyond?
Because consciousness interacts with our physical environment, reality. That is the missing link.
What if consciousness is a force to Earth just like gravity?
Is there a link between consciousness, extrasensory perception, and other anomalous events?
It could be a near-death experience with the beautiful white light, the interaction with many different types of entities. People have out-of-body experiences from meditation to psychoactive drugs.
And I think this is really important when you look at extraterrestrial experiencers or people that have had these peak experiences.
My daughter and I walked out of a movie theater at night. My daughter pointed up in the sky and she said, "What's that?" And it was just sitting there. It was a boomerang-shaped craft the size of a football field, a large orb telescoped open. It moved around like it was searching for something. Once you experience it, you can't go back. You know that reality is unbelievably bizarre.
And the dimensionality of consciousness is going to move us into advancing who we are as humans.
But we await the paradigm shift, which is critical in terms of our understanding the science of the subjective, integrating it with the science of the physical in order to better understand consciousness, reality, and maybe a little bit more about what life and reality is all about.
Will we break through the stigma of this science of the extraordinary and challenge the true nature of reality in the Consciousness Connection?
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Today, this is Grant Cameron, and I have a extremely interesting new guest here from Asia. I've done a couple of broadcasts from China, and if you see a ufology is an awful lot like an American project. Everybody just wonders what the Americans are doing, what's going on in America, and everybody forgets that's only 4% of the world's population, that there's the rest of the world. And so what I've tried to do is I've tried to go around the world and to talk to other people and other cultures that we may see as different or even as enemy if you get into China or Russia or whatever. And when you get down to talking to them, you find out that they're just people like you and I, and they got the same problems, the same concerns, the same spiritual concerns, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. My guest today is Pete Whitley from Japan. We're going to be talking about Japanese ufology today. Pete is the head of MUFON for Japan, And I wanted to talk to Japan after I heard that they had I opened a sort of a museum near Fukushima, the Fukushima reactor, and there was all these rumors about sightings. And of course, I was very curious as to, so what's happening in Japan? Because I think Japan would be sort of like I'm in Canada, not so much into, technology and stuff. It's a different sort of society in the United States. And so I was quite interested, and Pete reached out to me and said he would love to talk. And so he sent me a video today, which really changed the whole ball of wax here, because it's not, I was going to be talking about Japan UFO stuff, which we will talk about, but then we're going to get into one of the aspects of contact modalities is what's really going on here. And Pete has experience with out-of-body experience, which I wrote up in contact modalities. And I think a lot of experiencers have the ability to do out-of-body experience, maybe not as much as Pete has, according to what I've heard. But that's what I would like to go. And so we're going to talk a little bit about Japan, what's going on in terms of UFOs. And then we're going to get into this whole idea about really what's really going on here. What may be behind this whole thing, because I think Pete and I had a little pre-chat here, and we both sort of agree this goes a little bit beyond just UFOs flying around in the sky. It's a little more complex than that. And when you realize that, you realize this may be the biggest story that has ever been. This is basically, to me, always comes down to when you understand what's really going on with this, you understand how reality works. And we haven't got a clue when you start looking at some of the stuff that people have experienced. So welcome, Pete, and thanks for taking my invite to talk. And I'm looking forward to this discussion, and to hear especially the stuff that you've experienced in an experiment you did with out-of-body experiences.
Thank you very much for having me, Grant. It's a pleasure to speak with you. Absolutely.
Wonderful. So let's start. You're an American from the West Coast. And
yes.
So what leads you to Japan, and what leads you to ufology? How did you get into like these two aspects? Is like everybody gets down the rabbit hole. And I remember you saying that your wife is really not into it. Welcome to the club. I think that is the pattern. People always come to me and they say, "Oh, my family doesn't understand and they don't believe." And I say, "Welcome to the club." I think that's part of the thing is to keep you grounded, that you're not supposed to have any support. You're supposed to be on your own. So go through that. How did you get into Japan, and how did you get into ufology?
Let me start with how I got into Japan, then go back a little bit in time with the ufology thing. The Japan story is a little quicker. Back after I graduated university, I visited Japan. Really enjoyed my time here. Went back to the States. I studied counseling, became a counselor there in America. Spent all of my holidays here. Was drawn to Japan. Eventually, it just made sense. After about 5 years, I thought, you know what? I need to live there. So I moved on over. That was about 14 years ago. Like you said, I'm married, and now we have a son, permanent resident here, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. As far as ufology goes, what got me interested in the ufology field dates back to when I was about 17 years old. Prior to that, I had no interest in it. I was just interested in typical teenage things, whatnot, sports, etc. When I was about 17, I had a conscious abduction experience.
Okay.
Taken out of my room at night. It was pretty much the typical abduction scenario. Light came into my room. I saw a couple of small grays materialize. They took me out the window. I was terrified, frozen with fear. My memory of that stopped at that point. Now, the day after that happened, as soon as that happened, I was a believer. I knew what happened. I knew it wasn't a dream. It wasn't sleep paralysis. I didn't know even know the term sleep paralysis, but I knew it was real. You know what's real, and you know what's not. That night, that day, I became a believer. And in fact, I was really open about it. I told my family, the next day what had happened, and they said, oh, you had a nightmare or whatever, okay, whatever. About 6 months later, it happened again. I was taken on board a ship. This time there was a tall gray next to me, telepathically.
Can I
Yeah.
just interrupt and say, was it the same process, like the beings in your room and then taking you out through the window, and except that there's a tall gray this time?
No, the second time I actually awoke on board the ship.
Oh, okay.
Awoke on board the ship. Yeah, yeah. So the first time I was wide awake, and then I saw blue light come into my room. This second time I awoke aboard the ship. But I was wide awake, fully conscious. I was frozen, again, terrified. Telepathically, the tall gray, I could notice that he was a bit surprised, which I found interesting. Telepathically, he said, I'm going to put something in your ear. It won't hurt. He had a long, appeared to be metal device. He inserted it into my right ear. It did not hurt. At that point, I believe there was some sort of communication, as to like, okay, you're gonna go to sleep now. And I was out. The next morning, now in this instance, I just woke up on board the ship. I wasn't fully conscious when it began. So the next morning, even though I was a full believer because I knew what had happened the first time was real, this next morning, I thought, wow, it happened again, didn't it? But the first thing I did is I went into the bathroom next to my bedroom that morning, and I inspected my ear, something gone in my ear. I just put my finger in there a little bit. You're not supposed to put anything bigger than your elbow in your ear. But I swiped in there just a little bit. And there was a tiny bit, the smallest tiny bit of dried blood. Now, I don't know that is going to convince anybody that it was real or not. But I knew it had happened. And so maybe that was my second experience.
I just make a little comment on that, kind of a funny comment. I'm interviewing on Wednesday Deb Cobble, and if you've heard her story from Intruders, that's how it starts for her. They stick the thing in her ear. I don't know if it was the same in the right ear or left ear, right ear. And she said it hurt like sticking a hot knitting needle into her head. And they said, "Oh, sorry, that wasn't supposed to hurt." So she's telling an identical story to what you're telling. The way to describe it, like a large knitting needle and sticking it in your ear. So,
yeah, that's what it looked like, basically. Thankfully, however they anesthetized me worked for me. Exactly. So from that point forward, so I was 18 after that second experience, and again, I was open about it. I wasn't standing, I didn't open the windows and shout out to the world, hey, I was abducted by aliens. But when the subject would come up of UFOs or etc. in casual conversation, for years after, I'd always just say, hey, yeah, listen, I not only was on board a UFO, I saw a couple of aliens on 2 occasions. I've been, very open about it throughout my life.
Did you go down the rabbit hole? Can I ask if you went down the rabbit hole? Like a lot of people, when you have the experience, you can't read enough. You're sort of obsessed with, it's almost like the bug that, you're no longer in Kansas and that's game over. You're a different person. Was that what happened to you?
That's a very interesting question, Grant. It didn't happen immediately.
Wow.
No, it did not happen immediately. Shortly after I moved here to Japan, it was just in the back of my mind. Like I said, if the topic came up with friends, I would say what happened to me. Some of them believed me. Some said I was crazy. It didn't matter. Yeah. Shortly after I moved here, I saw a children's art exhibit. One of those posters, the drawings one of the children had made, had a UFO in it. Wow. And inside this child's drawing of a UFO was a gray alien head. And for some reason, as I looked at that poster this child had drawn, it dawned on me how strange the experiences I had were. And I thought, I wonder if anyone has written a book about this stuff. And this sounds so incredibly naive now when I look back. But I didn't realize there had been UFO books since, the 1950s. There was a treasure trove of information out there. So
what year are we talking here? Or
What's that?
year so about 14 years ago, you're saying this is?
Yeah, it was about 13 years ago, about 1 year after I moved to Japan.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. And so, what I found is not only were there books about UFOs, there are books specifically about the quote abduction experience.
Yeah.
As a researcher, I almost don't like to use the word abduction, but I was taken against my will, or I didn't, agree to it, so I'll just say that. But there are books about this. And so I specifically picked up a couple of books on the quote abduction experience. And what blew my mind, Grant, was the similarities. I mean, down to like, so many people described blue lights. Just like you mentioned, so many people described something that looked like a knitting needle. As soon as I read those first couple of books, I was down that rabbit hole, and I've been there ever since. Exactly.
Yeah. And so you had a third. That was what, 7 years ago? And so
Yeah.
in the meantime, you got involved with MUFON, and you got involved with the experiencer team. Go into that as well.
Yeah. Actually, the third experience 7 years ago was before I became involved in MUFON, but let me go ahead and fast forward just a bit. We'll go back to the third. Yes, I became involved with MUFON as I took what they called their experiencer survey. It's online.
Oh yeah.
And I filled it out. I just was looking, maybe, as part of my research, I was doing it independently, looking to get more information.
And that was Kathy Martin. Can you explain what the survey is, or what the team is?
Precisely, yeah. The team is composed of, I hate to give misinformation. I believe we have roughly 30 individuals on the team. Kathleen Martin was one of the co-founders of the team. She created said survey. Yes. What the Experiencer Resource Team does is when someone contacts MUFON and reports that they've had contact with non-human intelligence, the case is forwarded to us. We have physicians, we have psychotherapists, hypnotists, as well as just people like myself who have a long history of studying the phenomenon, available to give assistance to those that have had contact with these entities. Yeah.
And people maybe who aren't that familiar with the abduction scenario, and I guess you can call it the abduction scenario, because I always say, like, it may not be what it is, but when you use the word, everybody knows what you're talking about.
Yeah,
And so a lot of people, I remember Kathy Martin's aunt, when they first came forward in 1961. I mean, I remember they went to MUFON, not to Nightcap, which was the group at the time, and they said, "Come on." They grabbed you off the road. Are you insane? It was like, get out of here. Like, it was so far removed that this goes in patterns. So a lot of experiencers didn't come forward, still don't come forward, because it's kind of a scary thing, and it's a wild story to tell. So it's good that there is this experiencer support group that can basically just get people off the roof from jumping and saying, we're there too. And you may be able to confirm this, that once you tell your story publicly and you're out there, sort of the fear goes away, and it becomes a search rather than, being a victim.
100%. In fact, that most of the people that contact us, what they're looking for is exactly that. They want someone to say, listen, you're not crazy. There are others out there that have had this happen to them. We are amongst them, and like you said, admitting it happened is the first step, finding someone you can trust to talk about it with. And then that really frees up a lot of those negative emotions people feel, a lot of the fear they feel about ever speaking in public, and so on and so forth. Absolutely. And that's really what we hope to do, is just give people some peace of mind and allow them to be able to speak freely. These experiences have happened to so many people. And as you alluded to, Grant, that many people are just too afraid to say anything, and we really need to reduce that stigma. Yeah, that's a big part, one of our goals.
Yeah, because that's what and we'll get into this later. I always maintain that if you want to understand the phenomena and what's really going on, you got to talk to the people who are interacting with the intelligence behind the phenomena. It doesn't really help that much to look at lights in the sky, except to know that something weird is going on. But you've got to go to the people who are interacting. So these are very important people who I still think are being ignored, but at least they're getting support now from groups. And I think you'd probably confirm that majority of them, once they have the discussion, all that sort of fear starts to melt away, and they start to see a completely different. Because it would make sense that if you wake up in the middle of the night and there's two gray aliens standing there, I mean, who wouldn't be afraid? I mean, it's got to be the most frightening thing in the world. And so can you tell me, like, worldwide, because it's basically seen sort of as an American phenomena. It's like America and the abductions and all this sort of stuff. Is Japan, do we have experiences in Japan, or have they come to you? And can you go through a little bit about that, about what, so that people can get the idea that this is like a worldwide phenomenon. This is not just something that was developed in New York City in books.
It is absolutely not a North American phenomenon. It absolutely happens worldwide, and it absolutely happens here in Asia. Many of the traits and the things that happen to experiencers are the same all around the world, right? Yeah. Of course, there are differences. We're learning new things all the day. I mean, every day. Not everyone has the same experience. Every experience is different. Yeah. Very recently, I was actually contacted by an individual in China who had an experience, and they were so terrified because, if you can imagine, even in North America, for instance, how there's some stigma about it. From what they described to me, and I'm no expert on China, I cannot speak for China or the Chinese people, but from what they described to me, they said, listen, I'm terrified. People are going to think, I'm infected by demons or something like that. And that's exactly what they wanted, just some help, just some support, to be pointed towards some resources, right? And there are a wealth of resources out there for anyone who's had experience with this, right? And so, I would urge anyone listening to this that if you have had an experience and you're keeping it inside, contact someone. It doesn't have to be the MUFON ERT. Contact, there are many different organizations and resources. Get out there and seek some assistance, create a dialogue with someone. It's really going to help.
Do you have support groups there? I know I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, and I started a group. This would be going back probably 6 or 7 years. And I called it Experiencers Anonymous, which was based on Alcoholics Anonymous, because it's the same sort of thing, is that people they don't want to really be associated with these people. And so the idea was that you'd have a support group where people could come to a meeting, and nobody was ever allowed to ask anybody else, what's your story? What are you doing here? Whatever. And a person could sit in the back of the room for 2 years and say nothing. And at some point, someone's going to stand up and tell their story, and then they're going to go, oh yeah, I'm one of these people. I belong here. And because there's always this denial. No, it's not, I'm not one of these people. This is not going on. They're looking to have somebody tell them they're crazy, whatever. Do you have support groups in Japan where people get together and talk about this?
Not specifically for contact with non-human intelligence, no. There are new age groups here in Japan, that overlap a bit. One thing I've noticed since I've lived here in Japan and been a researcher here in Japan is that I would say the Japanese people are very open to the idea of UFOs and even to the idea of extraterrestrial life or non-human life out there, different intelligences. I would say, however, and I can't speak for the Japanese people. I'm an American, born an American. I've lived here for a long time, but I would never speak for another culture. But there, I don't run across a ton of people, save for those that reach out officially through MUFON or a source like that. I don't come across a ton of people who admit in day-to-day life that they've had contact with non-human intelligence. I do run across a lot of people who will admit in day-to-day life that they have seen a UFO or what they believe to be a UFO. Yeah.
So you have the group you run, help with the MUFON group, and can you talk a little bit about some of the main sightings that might be sort of like, you say there's no Roswell in Japan, but what are your sort of major sightings that that are talked about?
Yeah, we don't really have a Japanese Roswell. I would say one thing about Japan is there have been, I would say the sightings in Japan historically have sided more on the side of the lights in the sky that are obviously not stars or satellites variety, as opposed to like seeing an oblong shaped, cigar type object or a tic tac, etc., etc. Historically, that's more what we see here in Japan. Lights in the sky that appear to be intelligently and controlled. There are certain hotspots. We have had a lot of sightings around Mount Fuji. I think part of that may just be that people are up there with cameras all the time, right? Yeah. Fukushima has historically been a hotspot for UFOs, and they did open up the International UFO laboratory there this year rather.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's one of the things that sort of dragged me into trying to talk to somebody in Japan to give me some update on what's going on, whether it's very popular among people, or how's that going?
It seems to be. I'm in contact with them. Yeah. It's new. It generated a lot of press, not only here in Japan, but around the world. There are many foreign news services that picked up on it. But like I said, it's brand new. They do, however, house a large collection of articles and a huge knowledge base about the phenomenon, not just here in Japan, but elsewhere. They are affiliated with a magazine we have here called Mu, which deals with all sorts of paranormal phenomenon, relatively popular magazine. Yeah. So I think that's a big step, and hopefully it will keep growing. Yeah.
What about the films? We heard these rumors about these films around Fukushima after the disaster there. And have you looked into that? Because of course it runs into this whole controversy that, oh, this is all hoax and stuff. Did you look into that? And what's your opinion of all the videos that are floating around?
I've looked into it actually extensively, Grant, particularly recently. Yeah. It intrigued me back when it happened. I remember back when it happened, soon after, in the month that followed, these reports and videos started coming out. Unfortunately, at the time, I didn't act on it beyond just being an observer, and marking it down in my mind. Recently, I've done extensive research. I've contacted other researchers here in Japan. I've contacted video uploaders. Unfortunately, at this point, the original filmographers of said videos, virtually impossible to find. I could not track down anyone who knew exactly who filmed these. A few of the videos that purportedly were taken around Fukushima have been debunked as having happened somewhere else. But there are some very compelling videos that are clearly above Fukushima and close to the nuclear reactor, which were filmed after the disaster. Yeah. But unfortunately, locating the individuals that filmed these videos has so far proved to be impossible. If any of your viewers or listeners happen to have a lead on that, please get in touch with me, because I've been working on this for quite a while. Yeah.
I'll have to, maybe there's a reporter that I used to deal with, was formerly a reporter in Japan who provided me, and I don't know if you've seen this. She found in a collection of a Marine guy when they were moving his stuff to the Marine Archives in Washington, D.C., all sorts of photographs. He had been at Nagasaki on an American mission a couple days after the detonation of the bomb there to look at the disaster and take photographs and stuff. And suddenly he picks up, and they don't realize until they move this about the year 2000, they're moving it just before he dies to this archives, all these UFOs over Nagasaki right after the bomb. And the one is as clear as day. And I don't know if you've seen it. I can send you, and I'll see. She was sick the last time I talked to her. I can put you in contact with her, but she had an interesting collection. And I had the one photograph, which is really good, but apparently there's a whole series of photographs. So I remember I had even had a bizarre thing where I did the presidents. So then I went to the Truman Library and went to the Eisenhower Library, and I said, have you got any photographs of the Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombings? And they go, well, yeah, we got lots of them. And I said, and then they started showing, I said, have you got someone to show the sky? I'm not really interested in looking at the ground. And they're looking at me like, what are you doing?
Okay.
And I didn't find another one, but this is this connection to the nuclear connection, where you have that nuclear connection to UFOs. So I'll maybe try to put in contact, and I hope somebody can help you out with this thing with the films, because that's a very interesting concept. Because as you know, that's a big thing that's in front of the Senate now, is this thing like they're messing with our nuclear weapons. I mean, how dare they mess with nuclear weapons? And as you and I both know, whatever it is, the phenomena, the intelligence is very interested in nuclear weapons and nuclear stations and stuff like that.
100%. Time and time again, we see activity around all sorts of nuclear reactors, nuclear weapon sites, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, that's a huge concern of theirs. And so, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that, like you said, and I would love to see this photo, that a photo exists out there of one above Nagasaki. Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'll send you that photo. I have the one that I had, but she had a whole series of them. The other ones weren't quite as clear. But it was kind of an interesting connection. So in terms of Japanese, have you got any stories about people who found out about the group, or do they really watch American stuff? And because it would all have to be translated into Japanese, do they really know about the group? And is it that, do you get people from Japan actually contacting you and saying, I had this experience, not going public with it, but basically looking for help?
Yeah, we do. Yes, we do. MUFON's not nearly as well known here as it is in other countries. Of course, as the national director, it's something I'm working on, but we do get reports from here in Japan. One thing that really helped us was actually the Tic Tac videos and the Pentagon admissions. I worked with a producer at NHK to help him. He produced a video about over this past summer. And he went to America, and he actually spoke to members of MUFON there. I was the liaison between him and MUFON, and that helped gain us some traction here, which was, very, very, very grateful for that. Yeah.
Because is Nippon TV still around? Because they were big. I remember when the Area 51 thing, I think they were the first to appear after the Area 51 story broke, where they were sort of on the scene, and they seemed to be throwing some money at it. What's the media coverage like in Japan in terms of covering stories?
Media coverage is actually, we have quite a bit. I mean, relatively. There are frequently shows on, we have, TV here is quite a bit different. Variety shows, they call them, are kind of take the place of sitcoms, over here, where they have a group of cast members, talent, they call them, where they watch interesting videos and make commentary and stuff like that. UFOs are frequently featured on those shows. So yeah, it's not uncommon to see major media cover UFO stories. And of course, like everywhere else in the world, these past couple of years, a lot of attention has been on America, because that's where the big moves are being made right now at the Pentagon.
I think Elizondo indicated that the Japanese government was involved with some sort of disclosure or cooperating with the Americans. Do you know anything about that?
I believe what he was referring to, and my apologies to Lou.
I'm not sure either. Yeah.
Yeah. In September 2020, the JSDF, Japanese Self-Defense Force, drafted an official set of official protocol, I guess you might call it, for how to handle UAP or UFO sightings. That was made public. The fact that they did this. Now, the reports that the JSDF collects on sightings, those will not be made public. But I believe that is in reference to that group because, of course, they would be sharing information back and forth.
But
Yeah.
the Japanese, their military is not what I assume in the United States. It's basically
No,
All right.
by constitution, we're strictly a self-defense force, yes. But Japan does have a rather large military. We do have a rather large military, yeah.
Is there any famous people? Like I did a book on musicians, so I've got Hong Kong and almost every culture, major musicians. Have you got any major famous people who've come forward and identified sightings or experiences?
Yeah, well, several years ago, one of our past prime ministers, his wife came forward and said that she was more along the lines of a contactee, that she had been in contact with Venusians.
Wow.
That's probably the most notable example of that. Yeah, it was an interesting story. Yeah.
There's a story that comes, and now if I'd known, I would have looked it up before we did it. From about 1811, it's a story about a woman inside a sphere. Do you know this story? Because
Yeah,
one of the things I'll give you the background on this. One of the people that
Yeah.
I've followed, I spent a lot of time because when I had my UFO sighting in 1975, I knew that I wasn't going to figure this out, but I said, somebody's got to know what's going on here. So I would look at the highest level, the Canadian government, the highest level of the people in the Canadian government, listen to what they're saying, listen to what the president's saying, and saying, somebody's got to know what's going on here. And one of the people I chased around was a guy named Dr. Ron Pandolfi, who was supposedly ran the weird desk at the CIA. It was the guy that's rumored to have briefed the president on UFOs and stuff like that. Very high level guy from the CIA since 1983. And his wife is Arabic, and she would have sort of discussions on the internet about portals and weird stuff like that. He would never get involved. He'd maybe be in the room, but he would never say anything because he can't be public about anything. And she brought up this case, this Japanese case from 18 whatever, and she was telling people, and she was kind of indicating that this was an extremely important case for people to watch. And if it hadn't been for anybody else, but because she was bringing it up, I'm going like, what? So what is this case that she's talking about? You familiar with this?
Yes. It's known as the Utsuro Bune case. It's probably the most famous case in Japan. It's because it's something of a legend at this point. Yeah, like you said, in the early 1800s, what was described as a ship or some type of boat arrived here off the coast of Japan. It was described roughly as an oblong floating object. They found it in the water. When it opened up, there was a young lady in there that was said to be obviously not Japanese. She was said to be quite beautiful. She spoke in an unknown language. Inside this ship, there was writing of an unknown language. Wow. One interesting thing about that case is it is said that she had a box that was very dear to her that she would not let go of. Now, what is inside this box is completely unknown. She had some special box. Now, the inhabitants of this small fishing village where she was found took her in for, now reports vary a bit because it happened so long ago, for a day or a few days, depending on which report you go by. And eventually they put her back into her ship and sent her off, which at the time was actually the culturally appropriate thing to do. You know, they believe it said they gave her some food, some things to eat, some provisions, and then sent her back. So it wasn't a matter of, you know, get back out of here. That was just the culturally appropriate thing to do. You know, well, let's give her some provisions and send her back on her way. Communication was obviously very difficult between them. Yeah, but that's probably the most famous historical case we have here in Japan. Yeah.
If I could find the audio of that conversation, I think you'd be pretty interested, because when Aaliyah mentioned this and she wanted everybody to study up on this, and I'm going like, what's she talking about this case for? And it was just that her position being with this very high level intelligence officer in the United States, that she would go sort of public and exemplify this case. So fascinating stuff. There's some stuff to look into in Japan in terms of interesting stories. Now let's get to your third, remembered the ones that you remember, the abduction experience. So let's go to the third, and then let's get to the really interesting stuff here.
Yeah, my third conscious abduction occurred about 7 years ago. I visited Washington State with my wife and my infant son. He was just under a year old. We went there for the holidays. At that time, what happened was at night, the two of us were instantaneously transported up inside a UFO. What I took to be a UFO. I did, on the way up and the way down, I did not particularly notice the craft. It all happened so quickly. My infant son was seated directly across from me, eye level. What I thought was funny at the time is he was seated in what I can only describe as like an alien baby chair. It was just some sort of tall, molded, small chair for him to sit in. And at the time, when I first noticed him there, he communicated to me, and similar to the way the extraterrestrials or the grays or what have you, whatever you want to call them, communicate. He communicated to me telepathically, hello. Now, what struck me about this communication was, now, when you communicate telepathically with these entities, it's mostly it's not in words per se, it's more in ideas. So of course his hello was more of an idea. But what I gathered from that hello that he communicated to me was it was a perfectly formed, intelligent adult hello. It was not as if like a little baby saying hello, which this is kind of hard to describe, but it struck me as odd. To the right of me and to the left of him was a tall gray alien. In between all of us was a globe about the size of a basketball. Inside that globe was a purple liquid or gas. It was undulating and swirling around, but it's all contained inside a translucent globe. The next thing that happened is this tall gray communicated to me something along the lines of, if you agree to this procedure, you and your son will understand each other's souls. And I did not know what that means. I can't say, to this day, I still wouldn't say I know what that means. But, I was simply confused. There may have been some agreement on my part because this gray did something to that ball. I don't believe he physically interacted with it, but I could tell definitively that there was some interaction that happened between him and this globe. Immediately after that, my infant son and I shot back down from space, if you will, down through our atmosphere, through the clouds, through the ceiling, and into my bed. It happened in a fraction of a second, but Grant, I can remember the layers like I just described, to space. I remember coming through the atmosphere. I remember coming through the clouds. I remember coming through the ceiling. It was happened in a fraction of a second, but I remember every step of the way. What was odd is that when we arrived back into the house, I was lying down when we arrived. My infant son was sitting on my lap with the biggest grin on his face, almost laughing, wide awake, smiling, just as happy as could be. And if I hadn't had been conscious of what had happened just the moment before, I would have been completely perplexed as to how he possibly could have gotten onto my stomach. But having known what we had just been through, I realized, okay, we came back and they put him on my stomach. So I took my infant son, I put him back to bed, and I went to sleep. Yeah, kind of. At that point, my first two conscious abductions were terrifying. I was absolutely terrified. Like I said, frozen in fear. This experience wasn't terrifying whatsoever. It was very confusing. You know, I was very confused throughout it, but I was not scared during this experience. And I don't know if that's a product of the fact that at that point I had been researching the phenomenon for a while or not, but there was no fear to be had during that time.
Is it always the tall gray that does the interaction? Because what you'll see in a lot of experiences is that people will interact with a lot of beings, but there's generally one being that deals with them and comforts them and talks to them and explains. Is that what your experience is?
Yeah, the tall gray seems to fill a role of perhaps what we might call in English a scientist or a doctor, or some fills a role something like that. They seem to have be in charge of whatever procedures it is that are going on there, whereas the smaller ones seem to be more of a helper type.
Yeah.
Yes.
And your son really hasn't done any UFO stuff, except you mentioned one case when he was like 3 where the weird thing happened. Can you explain that story?
Yeah. When he was about 3, I was sitting on the sofa, scrolling through my phone, doing some research, and I was looking for a particular picture that someone had drawn of a gray alien. And now, like we mentioned at the start of this grant, my wife despises the subject. We don't talk about it at home. I don't have any pictures of UFOs or aliens around the house. We don't speak of it. It's something I do privately. It's a passion of mine, but it's not something we talk about. So as I scrolled through the pictures of these gray aliens, trying to find the one I was looking for, my son, who was sitting beside me, he pointed out and he said, in his, baby English, it's an alien. And I didn't know he even knew the word. And I said, yeah. And he said, it's not a real alien, though, in the sense that they were pictures people had drawn, is what I took it to be. He said, but Daddy met a real alien, and he was really scared. And I said, yes, I did. He also, after that, I actually looked up image search for UFOs, and I showed him a picture of a UFO. And I said, do you know what this is? And he said, alien car. He said it was an alien car. I thought that was odd because at that point in his life, I believe he had just begun going to preschool, but I don't think his preschool did a lot of education about UFOs. I doubt there was a chance for him to pick any of this information up at home. I thought that was a bit odd. It kind of made me think, there might be something going on there. But Now he's nearly 8 years old. He shows no particular interest in UFOs or the subject. Yeah.
Now, you've had other experiences that you had missing time, but no recollections. Can you talk about, you mentioned one in a field. Can you go through
Yes.
some of that stuff where you realized something else was happening, but you don't have any real recollection?
Yeah. I used to travel via Highway 101, I believe it is, in Washington State, up and down, going back and forth from college to my parents' house or to visit friends. For various reasons, I would travel on Highway 101. I would usually take these trips at night. For some reason, I preferred to go at night.
Mhm.
Now, after having studied the phenomenon for a great deal of years, it seems that sometimes people are drawn to driving to less populated or rural areas at night. May have been a factor. At any rate, during one of these trips at night, I was driving along and there was a certain field behind a farm feed store, or a store that, caters to farmers and whatnot. There's a rather large field behind this place. And I saw a craft, a typical saucer-shaped UFO. There were some lights beneath it. It was partially illuminated on top. Now, this store that it was behind, where the field was behind, there were a couple of lights in front of the store. So the area was also a bit illuminated by this store. It was closed, of course. This is probably 9 or 10 p.m. I would travel rather late at night. And so I pulled over. I parked my car near the side of the store, right at the entrance to the field, so that I could take a look at what that was. But after that, my memory of the incident stops. I woke up the next morning in my bed. Yeah, no idea how I got home. Yeah. I've also had other experiences of missing time as well, confirmed by people I was on the way to visit, where they'd say, typically my drive would take about 2.5 hours. On one particular instance, I was again traveling at night. I left about 7:30 p.m. So I should have arrived there at about 10 p.m.
Yeah.
And about halfway through this journey, a song came on the radio.
Oh, wow.
A song that I enjoyed. And so I remember driving, particularly at the time, I was really feeling this song. I was grooving to this song. I really enjoying this song. When the song ended, however, I was nearly at my destination, which immediately struck me as very strange. I thought, was that on repeat? It didn't seem like it was on repeat. I remember thinking, is there some huge drum solo? I never noticed. But no, it's a 3-minute song. I was nearly at my destination. I arrived at my destination about 11 o'clock or shortly thereafter. And the person I was visiting said, "What happened? You called me at 7:30, said you're on the way."
Yeah.
I said, "I don't know. I left at 7:30. Here I am." I didn't mention the odd experience with the song. It's one of those things that kind of hit me after the fact. After we had that conversation, I thought, that's a bit odd. Yeah.
Now, with experiences, as we had a little pre-chat, you start getting a lot of paranormal stuff happen. Did you have stuff like synchronicities? Like, I wrote a whole book on the song thing, where you get these bizarre things where I get this message from beings that say the message is in the music, and I have no background in music, and I end up writing a book on music, on these bizarre paranormal things around music and experiencers with music and stuff like that. So have you when you start having your experiences, Did you start having these paranormal experiences, or have you had weird stuff all your whole life?
I've actually kind of had weird stuff my whole life. I don't count these as, well, these aren't conscious abductions or interactions, but from when I was a child, around 5 years old, I would have severe bloody noses, right? I also had a particular habit of needing to tuck myself in very tightly into the corner of the room in my bed. I do remember we used to spend a lot of time at my maternal grandmother and grandfather's house. And there was a special guest bedroom that I would usually stay in alone. I would always insist on keeping the blinds open. And I remember my hope at the time, or there was some feeling at the time that I'm going to leave these open in case I see something, and I don't recall ever seeing anything there. I do also recall, however, at my maternal grandmother and grandparents' house, I would wake up in the middle of the night, and this sounds a bit odd. I would play with children who at the time I perceived to be nieces or nephews or even my siblings. Mm-hmm. But of course, the next morning it would turn out that they either weren't at the house or they indeed didn't wake up and play with me. So there are some rather paranormal things like that. I mean, related, you hear stories like this typically among contactees and abductees. There's been a pattern of that. Yeah. I would say that I don't know if I could say I've had a ton of synchronicities, but there have been times in my life where I have met people and almost instantly we kind of made a connection, like either, oh, hi, or, whatnot, a short connection. And I would think in my mind, I've seen that person before. And deep in my heart, the feeling was, I've seen them up in the skies. I've seen them aboard a UFO. But I would, honestly, this is probably the first time I've ever even mentioned it. I would never say that to anyone,
Yeah.